I'm TJ Bill and a grateful Al-Anon. And I don't want to be so anonymous that y'all don't know who I am. Just so you'll know, my name is Tawana Joe Bell. And I'm a member of the Suburban Al-Anon family group in Odessa. And I'm really proud of my home group. And I can hear Roy Bell saying, if you're not happy at your home group, then you stay there and you make it a good place. Don't come over and mess up mine. If you're ever in Odessa and you need a meeting, I go regularly to the Monday night meeting at 8 o'clock and Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. And I started, because there was a issue and conflict at my group, a lot of the members quit coming. And because I needed a meeting so badly, I started going to the Serenity group in Midland. So I've been going to that meeting at 5:30 on Wednesday night. So I try to get that in too because I need to get my cup filled up. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you for my hotel room. Whoever, I think it was Matt, the one that made the arrangements for me. I didn't know, when I was asked to come talk here, I was always taught you don't say no to any AA or Al-Anon request. You just put it on your calendar. And that's what I did. And about, I think it was exactly 2 weeks ago is when I found out that my granddaughter was graduating from high school. And her graduation was last night. And they had a party afterwards. And, of course, I'd already made the commitment to come talk here. And so I was trying to figure out what time I was going to leave Odessa so that I wouldn't miss out on the miracle of witnessing my granddaughter's graduation and celebrating with her and then being here. And so I rolled into Lubbock last night about 1:05 and got my room, and I'm so grateful for it because I had a king-size bed, and I want y'all to know you got your money's worth because I got right in the middle of it and enjoyed every square inch of it. And once I finally did fall asleep, I didn't wake up this morning until about 20 minutes before my alarm went off. So I know I'm rested because I woke up before the alarm. And so I'm grateful for that room. I also want to tell you that I used both towels when I took my shower this morning. I spent an extra 15 minutes in the shower because that felt so good. But I just want y'all to know you got your money's worth out of the hotel room. Also, I had a big basket of snacks. I was planning on bringing one of my sponsees with me. She's a very interesting young woman that joined Al-Anon in the fall. She divorced her alcoholic. She lived in North Dakota. In January, she decided she needed to get away from him, and so she moved to Odessa, got a job at UTPB teaching. She's a doctor, and I'm sponsoring her now, and she hadn't been to very many conferences, and I thought this would be a good experience for her. But last weekend, she went to North Dakota to see her children for Mother's Day, and spent some time with her ex-husband and got all stressed out, and she's got gout, and she's got other issues, and she wasn't able to walk to come with me today, so I think they put extra snacks in the basket thinking I was going to have company, and so I'm going to probably eat that whole basket of snacks on my way home to stay awake. So thank you for my basket of snacks. I was told in a general way to tell what happened and what it's like today, and so to the best of my ability, I will do that. I was born in Odessa, and for the young man that had those things to say about Odessa, it's okay, I'll forgive you. But I was born to a wonderful couple that loved each other. They believed in family, and my dad was a real hard worker, worked in on an oil rig for as long as I can remember, and we followed the drilling rig wherever the drilling rig went, and we always kind of managed to get back to Odessa, so that was home and has been home for all my life. My mother took on the responsibility of making for sure that we were grounded in our faith, and she took us to the Baptist church every time the doors opened. And so I was familiar with that we did the church thing. I was a good girl. I did what I was supposed to do. And we rocked along until I got to be a teenager, and I didn't always agree with my mother in the way she did things. And my mother was my mother was a hoarder, and she had all of these massive collections that was hard for me to deal with, and I wanted to throw them away because it was usually those little red plastic rings on the gallons of milk jugs. She saved those, and Cool Whip bowls, and there would be like hundreds, maybe even thousands. She saved the Baptist Standards that's from 1960, and there were church bulletins that she would make notes on, and she saved all of those. She didn't throw anything away. And that was a problem for me because I thought, there's no way that you're going to read this stack of newspapers. And I would throw them away, and she would be upset, and we would fight over stupid things like newspapers. And all I could think of was, it's the first time I get out chance, I'm going to get out of this house. And so the first guy that came along that showed me any attention, I married him. He just happened to still be in high school, and to get him out of high school, I wrote his English paper so that he could graduate so that we could get married. I wrote a paper on natural gas compressor units. And because he wasn't all that bright, I knew I couldn't make an A on it, so he got a B-. As soon as he graduated, we got married. And that was my solution to get out of the house because I didn't want to be there. And I was tired of doing everything the way that my mother wanted it. And I was tired of the fights, and that was my solution to get out of the house. And one of the things that happened, though, when I was in the 5th grade, one of those times that we were at church, and I'd already been a born-again baptized believer and had already rededicated my life I don't know how many times, and it was one of those Sunday services that it was in the evening, and we had been there all afternoon because we went for training union, we went for prayer meeting, we went for the Sunday night service, and then my mother was in the choir, and it was the choir afterwards, so we were there forever on a Sunday. And on Sunday night they were singing the call, having the call, and they were playing Jesus is softly and tenderly calling one more time, and the preacher said, we're waiting for that one person that's not being in adherence to God's will, come forward now. And so I went ahead and walked down to the front and surrendered my life to foreign service, and I was going to be a missionary somewhere in the jungles of Africa, and I was going to live in a grass hut with a dirt floor, and at the age of 10, my life was over because God's will was going to be awful. And so that was my perception of God, and I didn't want really any part of it. So after getting out of their household, I thought, I'm going to do what I want to do, and everything's going to be fine. We rocked along. Things seemed to be going okay. And he was younger than me, so I thought all he needs is some little responsibility. He just needs to grow up and he'll be fine. So I made the decision without any input from him that we needed to have a child. And so I immediately got pregnant, thought it was a great idea. And part of the things that was happening at that time was that Bob spent a lot of time looking at pornography. And I thought, well, boys will be boys. That's part of it. Don't worry about it. And it got to be a kind of an issue because there were, at that time, 2 topless bars in Odessa, and those were the places that he would go. So instead of driving to all of the bars in Odessa, I just went to 2 because he was either at one of those 2 places. I didn't have a problem with that. He just needed to come home and behave. And so, again, my thinking was once we get this baby in the household, then things will change. And even at the point when we were trying to name this child, and it was real easy a decision in that we decided that if we had a boy that we were going to name him after the first names of our fathers, and I thought that was a great idea. But we couldn't agree on a girl's name. And I wanted to name, I always had this vision of my daughter's name being Devon, and I could visualize making the capital D and making the V go really far over her name, and how fun it would be to write the name Devon. And I wanted it to be Devon, and he said, I don't like that name. I don't like it. So we couldn't agree on a name. And one night, about 2 in the morning, he woke me up and said, what do you think about the name Danielle? And I was kind of impressed that he woke me up at 2 in the morning that he thought of this name. And I thought, how wonderful. And I could still do my capital D. And yeah, that'll be. And I said, okay, it's agreed. If we have a girl, we'll name her Danielle. Little did I know, and I found out about 6 months later that Danielle was named after Miss April out of the Playboy Bunny. My daughter doesn't particularly like me telling that story. At the time, I didn't know it, because this was a long time ago, 40-something years ago. Just like the disease of alcoholism, it progressed. It was a disease, and I didn't understand that. I was young and naive and kept thinking, it'll be different. He gets more responsibility, it'll be different. He gets a better job, it'll be different. If we get a better house, it'll be different. If we get new carpet, it'll be different. There was always something thinking that, whatever that hole was in him that made him do that he would quit doing it, and it just progressively got worse. And he was working a lot, working out of town a lot, and he was at the time of our daughter's, I think it was her 7th birthday. He was out of town and not going to be home for her birthday. So, again, this was a real long time ago, and I rented one of those video cameras that had a great big cassettes in them, and so that we could document her birthday party. And because one of the things I resented growing up is that there were 4 of us kids, and there wasn't always a lot of money, and my mother wasn't able. It wasn't a big deal. Birthdays were not a big deal. You were lucky if you got a cake. But when Danielle was born, every birthday was a big deal. We had a cake, we had a character, we had parties, we had games. I went all out, so it was a big deal. And so I didn't want him to miss out on the memory of that party. So I rented a camera to take a video of her party. And about 6 months later, he recorded over that video with some pornography. And that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, is that I didn't want to live like that anymore. And I had come to terms with the fact that I would rather be by myself than to live with this. And I didn't want my daughter to think that was okay, the relationship that we had, because it got to the point where I didn't want to be with him, and what I was doing was going into her bedroom at night and sleeping in the bed with her just to stay away from him. And I didn't want her to think that was normal. And so I was on a softball team at our church, and there was a lady on my team that had been married 5 times. And so I thought she would probably have some experience with divorces and divorce attorneys. And I said, I've decided to get a divorce. Do you know of any good divorce attorneys? And she said, yeah, Roy Bell. You need to go see him. He'll take good care of you. So I made an appointment, went to go see Roy, and as soon as I saw him, I knew I was going to hire him because he was good looking. And I spilled my guts and told him everything that was going on at our house and what my fears were. And he said, don't worry, sugar, I'll take good care of you. And filed for a divorce and was going through the process. And one of the things my ex-husband said to me at the time was, the only way that you're going to be able to make it on your own or even to pay for your divorce is if him. And I said, I hadn't thought about that. I'll see if we can work out an arrangement. So the next time I went into Roy's office, I told him about that conversation, and I said, so I was just wondering if we could work something out here. And Roy said, well, firstly, I don't screw my clients, And secondly, my secretaries don't know how to put that on the books. I've always given Roy a hard time about that, but anyway. After my divorce was final, Roy called me and said, "You're no longer my client. Would you be willing to meet up with me?" And I'm like, well, sure. I'd been a good girl all my life, and being good hadn't really paid off. And so I thought, I'm all for fun and games. Let's go. And so I started, anytime he called, I would go to meet him, and we had fun. And I was also dating other men at that same time. I was just going to run and play and have fun because being a good girl didn't pay off. And it wasn't very much longer after we started spending time together that Roy said to me, and I knew he was married. I need to clarify that. I knew he was married, but I didn't care. I had fun with him. He was fun to be with, and I was just in it for the fun. And after I'd been spending it was a few months, 4 or 5 months after that, Roy said to me, "I don't really like the fact that you're seeing these other guys." And I thought, well, that's really rich because you're going home to your wife every night. So I don't think you have a whole lot of room to talk. And he said, well, I don't like the way I'm feeling because I'm falling in love with you and I want to be with you. And that kind of surprised me, because I had in my mind, he was kind of like right up here. He was handsome, he was clever, he was smart, he was well-to-do, and I was just a plain old girl. What does he want to have anything to do with me? And I didn't realize how low my self-worth and self-esteem was until I met Roy. And then there was something that happened just spending time with him that I flourished. I began to feel better about myself. And it was a really good feeling. And I said to Roy that I was willing to make a commitment, but I didn't know where this was going to go. And he said, I have never been in a committed relationship, and I want to be in one, and I want to do that before I die, and I want to do it with you. And I said, okay. So I made a commitment to Roy at that point, and he told me that he had this lawsuit that was in the works, and that would enable him to financially do what he needed to do so that he could walk away. And my good friend that had told me about Roy said, men don't leave their wives. You're a fool if you believe what he's telling you. And for some reason, I believed Roy. I don't know why. I just believed him. And I liked the way that I felt when I was with him. And I loved Roy. And I was willing to do whatever it took. And after that lawsuit happened, and Roy came out and told his then wife what was going on. And it was a difficult time for them, because they'd been married for a long time and they had children together. But as soon as they got divorced, Roy and I got married. I'm not very proud of that, but I am proud of the relationship that we had, because Roy was my knight in shining armor. He was my handsome prince. He was my everything. He was my soulmate. He was my best friend. He was my confidant. He was my everything. And I was thrilled to death that we were together. I had told my parents that he was getting a divorce, and that as soon as he was divorced, that if he ever asked me I was going to marry him, I was going to say yes. So they knew that I was interested in Roy. And I had already made a decision that I didn't want a big wedding or anything. I was content with just getting married at the courthouse, because I just wanted to be with Roy. I didn't need to have a big show of the event. And of course, there was a little of the shame that, he was still married at that time. Anyway, we got married, and my mother thought that we were living together. And so my birthday, that fell right after when we got married, we all got together at my brother's house for my birthday. And my mother had crocheted this little yellow wash rag, and she came into the room and said, "I'm giving you a symbolic gift this year for your birthday. Clean up your act." And she threw that yellow crocheted wash rag at me. And I hated my mother with every fiber in my being. And I thought, for the first time in my life, I'm really trying to do the right thing and be the best I can be. And this is how you treat me in front of my new husband. And I didn't want to be around her, and I didn't speak to her for several months after that. Meanwhile, Roy and I were spending a lot of time. We were doing all these family things. We were going on trips. We were going to AA functions. And Roy had already told me that he didn't care if I went to Al-Anon or not. But he told me that AA was a very instrumental part of his life, and that without AA he couldn't stay sober, and that was a non-negotiable. And he gave me a copy of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have a second edition. And he told me that I needed to read it, that was a part of what he was. And I read the book, thought it was great, was delighted that he was staying sober. And I didn't want to do anything, because I'd heard enough of his drunk stories that I didn't want him to be like that again. And so, supporting him in his program was going to be a piece of cake. And again, he said, "I don't care if you go to Al-Anon, I just want you to be supportive of my program." And so I went to open meetings with him. I went to conferences with him for a year. And one of the guys that Roy sponsored, D. Rose, was having a birthday in July in Midland at the 710 group. And we were invited to dinner, went to dinner. And as we were going to the 710 group, we were just about to cross the threshold of the building to go into the building, and of the doorway to go in the building. And Roy said, "Oh, TJ, I just remembered, their meetings over here are closed for birthday night." And I said, "What do you mean closed?" And he said, "Well, you can't go into the AA meeting. You're going to have to go to Al-Anon." And I said, "How could you, Roy? I don't want to go to Al-Anon." And he said, "Well, you don't really have a choice." And about that time, this gorgeous blonde-haired lady met me at the door and said, "Oh, TJ, I'm so glad you're here. Let me show you where the Al-Anons meet." And she takes me into the Al-Anon room at the 710 group in Midland and introduces me to Betty Sadler, Jean Jones, Pat G., and Maxine Holman, and another gray-haired lady, and I can't think of her name right now. All of them had more than 20 years in Al-Anon, and she put me right in the big middle of all of them. And, the meeting was okay, and I thought, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. Maybe it's okay for me to go, because it had been about a year since Roy's ex-wife had quit going to Al-Anon. And I didn't trust the Al-Anons, because Roy had already told me that all of the women that went to Al-Anon were members of the church where they went. And so I wasn't a big fan of the idea of being among all of her friends. And that was one of my hesitancies to go into Al-Anon. So I thought, well, maybe it won't be so bad. So in July of 1986, I went to my first Al-Anon meeting at the Suburban Group permanently and became a member. One of the things I remember that happened is the first month and a half, maybe 2 months that I was there, they would spend 20 minutes of their meeting complaining about how nasty the carpet was in our room. And it was nasty. There were coffee stains all in the carpet. And the carpet was kind of an ugly color anyway. It was striped and with oranges and golds and browns. And it was not very, it wasn't pretty. But every meeting they would complain about the carpet for about 20 minutes. And then they would have a meeting, and I'm like, I was kind of hungry about what the program part, and I know how to clean. And so One time between meetings, I asked Roy if I could borrow the key to the group, and I went to the grocery store, and that was when you could rent those carpet cleaners. And I rented a carpet cleaner, and I cleaned the carpet. Gave Roy his key to the door back, and we went to the next meeting, and the women said, "Oh, look, those alcoholics finally cleaned our room." I didn't say a word about it, but I was delighted because we got right into the meeting and talked about the literature, so there wasn't any more wasted 20 minutes of the meeting griping about those nasty alcoholics that weren't cleaning up after us. And so that's when I really joined Al-Anon, after I cleaned the carpet and became a member of the suburban group. There were many things that I heard early in recovery, especially when people would talk about making amends to their family and restoring those relationships. And one of the things that the sponsor that I got later talked about was that her mother was one of those women that she just didn't click with. And I could relate to that. And that woman was Nelda when she told the story about her mom. And I thought, I want what that woman has. And that was that same blonde, gorgeous lady that took me over to the room of the Al-Anons. And I forgot to tell y'all this part. After the meeting was all over with that night, I said, "Where did that pretty blonde-haired lady go? She didn't stay for the Al-Anon meeting." And he said, "TJ?" And I'm like, "What? Where'd she go?" And he said, "She's an alcoholic." And I said, "Oh, Roy, she's much too gorgeous and pretty to be an alcoholic. She couldn't be." And he said, "Trust me, she is." Well, that gorgeous woman became my sponsor because she also went to Al-Anon. And when Nelda told that story about her mom, I knew that's who I was going to pick to be my sponsor. And I got Nelda to help me because I didn't like the relationship that I had with my mom. And so she helped me, and she said, "Are you willing to do anything I tell you to do to repair that relationship?" And I said, "Yes." And so she started the process with me, looking at doing a 4-step, and finally, for the first time in my life, I looked at my part in that relationship. And I was a very mouthy, disrespectful adolescent most of the time to her, and I treated her poorly. And she said, "You need to change your attitude toward your mom." And I didn't realize many of the things that I was doing. Didn't look at my part. I was too busy blaming her, because if she hadn't have said what she said, I wouldn't have done what I did. If she hadn't have done what she did, I wouldn't have said what I said. So I blamed her for every poor thing I ever said in that relationship. And for the first time, through working the steps and looking at my part, I saw that there were a lot of things that I needed to change. One of the things that I didn't realize that I was doing is when I would get in the car to go over to my parents' house, I would be thinking, okay, now if she brings this up and says this, then I'm going to say that. And if she brings this up and tells me I did something wrong, I'm going to tell her this. And if she brings up how I'm not being a very good mom, I'm going to tell her that she wasn't a very good mom either. And so I'd already get defensive before I even got to the house. And by the time I got to the house, I was ready for the fight. And I didn't even realize that I was doing that. And so that was one of the behaviors that I changed. And one of the things that Nelda said, "When you go over to your folks, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I go over to my dad, and I kiss him, and I get in his chair, sit in his lap, because I'm a daddy's girl." And she said, "Okay, from now on, when you go over to your parents' house, you're going to seek your mother out first, and if she's doing something, you're going to ask her, 'How can I be of service to you?'" And I thought that was the stupidest thing I ever heard. And so I learned how to be of service to my mom. And part of my attitude was there were always the clutter everywhere, and I was always just put out with you couldn't even go in and sit down on the couch because there'd be stuff on the couch. And before I would take the stuff and slam it in another area. And she told me to quit doing that. And then she said to me, "Your mom has a form of mental illness." And I did not know that. So with a changed attitude toward my mom, that relationship became different. And then there were several things that Nelda told me to do. "You're going to start telling your mother you love her, and you're going to start hugging her." And I'm like, "Oh, Nelda, you don't know what you're asking me to do, my mother's not that kind of a, now, with Danielle, my mother would kiss on that child and hug her and tell her how precious she was and how wonderful she was and how much she loved her. But I would look at it and who is this woman? Because it certainly wasn't the way she treated me. And she said, I want you to hug your mom and tell her that you love her. And so I started that process. And I remember the very first time I hugged her, it was like hugging a telephone pole. And she did not respond. And Nelda said, that doesn't matter. You just do it anyway. And so it got to where she would ease up, and then it got to where her arms would wrap around me, and it got to where it was a legitimate, wonderful hug. And the I love yous came. It was the first. It was I do you too. We do. And then it was I love you. And I'm so grateful that I did the footwork and made the amends and was the daughter that I needed to be, such that when my mother had an aneurysm. She was air vac'd out of Odessa to Lubbock because they didn't have the services that she needed there. And en route, her aneurysm ruptured and she had permanent brain damage as a result. And my mother was very childlike the last 5 years of her life. But as a result of me having done the footwork over years, I was able to be the daughter that I needed to be during that time. And my siblings all had jobs. I was going to school on the Roy Bell Scholarship Fund. And I took a semester off and was of service to my parents. And I would spend Monday through Friday at Lubbock with my mom and dad here. And then I would go home on Friday. And my siblings would come up on the weekends to give me a break. And I did that from January to through mid-April, the entire time my mother was in the hospital here. They told my dad that she would be dependent on all of her basic needs for the rest of her life, and they recommended that they take her off the ventilator, but my dad couldn't do that. And so my mother spent the last 5 years in a nursing home. Before my mother got sick, on my last birthday, the birthday before my mother got sick, I had cleaned out one of my closets in my house. I discovered that I was a collector of fabric, and I wasn't doing anything with it, and I decided this is stupid to have all this fabric in here, and I'm going to give it to my sister because she's a seamstress, and so is my mother. But I said to myself, I'll give it to my sister because she's got 3 girls and she can sew for them. And also in there was a quilt that I had started to make for Danielle, because I thought, how hard can it be? And I sewed all of these squares together, and instead of coming out with a rectangle, it was more like a parallelogram. And I got really frustrated with it, just wadded it all up, put it in a paper bag, and shoved it in that closet. Well, when I cleaned that closet out, I laughed at my attempt at a quilt and just put that in that fabric that I gave my sister. Well, my sister showed it to my mother, and my mother took that quilt apart, stitched it back together, and for my birthday, before she got sick, she gave me the quilt. And that's the part of the story that I always forget, because I went from the yellow rag to that quilt that my mother redid my mistake and made this beautiful quilt, and she gave it to me for my birthday, and she said, I don't know if this is your quilt or Danielle's quilt, but it's yours. And I said to her, I know exactly what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to put it in my hope chest, and that's going to be the quilt that I give my first grandchild. And so my mother died before my daughter got married, and when my daughter got married and was pregnant, I gave her that quilt that my mother had made, which was the last gift she gave me. So we went a long way from the yellow rag to the quilt. And I'm so grateful to Al-Anon that I was able to do that and have that good relationship with my mom. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Roy had two sons. One son that was the ranch foreman that, in Al-Anon we're told that we don't have the right to diagnose somebody else's disease. But if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, and there was a whole lot of quacking going on at the ranch. And it got really bad, to the point that nobody wanted to go to the ranch anymore because John was just out of control. And I watched Roy bail him out of trouble over and over and over again. And I popped off to Nelda and saying, as much as Roy has spent on bailing John out of trouble, I could have had a Mercedes. And she said, I want you to go to your house and touch everything that Roy has given you and quit being so ungrateful. And besides that, I think probably you need to get busy and get a job so you're not so preoccupied with what Roy's doing with John. And so that's when I started teaching. And I found out that when I was teaching at school, the kids had to learn, they had a math lesson, they needed a reading lesson, they needed a social studies lesson, they needed a science lesson. Somewhere in there we had to go to PE, and we had to go to library, and we had to go to music, and we had to go to lunch. So we had this schedule that we had to keep up with. And so as a result of having these 26 kids in my charge, I stayed pretty busy keeping everybody where they needed to go, chop. I was a really good manager at school. And I found out that at school, I wasn't preoccupied with what John was doing or what Roy needed to do for John. And I remember telling Roy, you need to go to Al-Anon. And I said, you're going to enable your son absolutely to death if you don't do something different, Roy. And Roy said to me, my program is working very well, thank you very much. And I said again, Roy, you need to go to Al-Anon in Midland because you don't need to come to my meeting. And he said to me again, thank you, my program works very well. And so I reported that to Nelda, and she told me it was none of my business, that I needed to stay out of that was Roy's relationship with his son. It wasn't any of my concern. And she said, the only thing you can say about John Bell is if it's kind, if it's true, and it's necessary. That's the criteria for anything you talk about John Bell. And I said, well, a lot of the things that I want to say are true, but they're not really very kind or necessary. And so she said, that ought to simplify what you say about John. And so a major part of my program was just keeping my mouth shut. And as a direct result of keeping my mouth shut, and how alcoholism works out is that we got a call. It was on a Good Friday, one of those calls at 2 a.m. And Roy answered the phone, and we heard it was on the landline. In those days, on the landline, if it's quiet in the the dead of the night, you can hear what the person on the other end of the line is saying. And he said, this is Deputy McCoy from the Brown County Sheriff's Department, and there's been a shooting at the ranch. And Roy and I both just held our breath. And then I didn't hear any more of the phone conversation. I could hear John's girlfriend screaming in the background, and that's all I could hear. And my heart just sunk. As it turned out, that we were told that John shot at this guy. They were all drunk. They'd all been out drinking, and the odd thing about it was they were with her ex-husband and his girlfriend, and it was just, what, I don't even pretend to understand it, but they had been out drinking, and they'd gone back to the ranch to drink some more. Things were said, and they left in a huff, and John decided to shoot at them on their way out of the off the property, and he hit the back windshield of the pickup glass, and it shattered, and this guy had wounds from the glass. But because it involved a gun, John was charged with attempted murder. I was really proud of Roy because he told John that he needed to find his own attorney, that he wasn't going to represent him. And I knew that was really hard for Roy, but I also knew that he didn't want to take on the responsibility because John was looking at 20 years at that time. Roy's other son, Tom, was good friends with another attorney there in Odessa, and Tom said to Roy, "Do you mind if I get Abner to represent John?" And Roy said, "You do whatever you need to do. I just know I can't do it." And so John ended up going to the penitentiary. And that was really hard for Roy, and it was really hard for the entire family. But for me, it was like, because he wasn't at the ranch drinking and causing chaos, and it wasn't costing us anything. And the only thing that did happen, and Roy and I were both in agreement, because John went to the penitentiary, he had responsibility of a child. He was divorced from his wife at that time, and he was paying child support. And Roy and I had a discussion about child support, and I said, I don't have any problem at all in us paying child support while John's in the penitentiary, because she didn't have anything to do with this. It's not her fault. And so, what piddly amount that we were paying for child support is not a big deal. So that was one thing we were in agreement. And I didn't feel like that was enabling, that we needed to do that for our granddaughter. And I'm glad that we did that, because when Tessa died, when she was 23 years old, there was no regret or remorse of anything that we didn't do as grandparents. And I knew that we had done our part. So there was no guilt or shame in that. So I was glad of that decision. But during that time, that was like the dread, the relief that John was incarcerated and we're not having to deal with the consequences of what he was doing while he was drinking. There was also the dread of, what is it going to be like when he gets out? And meanwhile, we're still doing what we always did, go to meetings, going to conferences. And I was always really glad that when we went to conferences, because there was always an Al-Anon speaker. And I thought, Roy is not going to go to Al-Anon, but he's going to hear the Al-Anon speaker. And so we were at Lakeside, and there was a Al-Anon speaker from Oklahoma. And right now, her name just went right out of the window, but she was telling her story about going and bailing her son out of trouble one more time. But she had been going to Al-Anon. And she had that realization that she was enabling her son, and that she couldn't go back to her meeting and hold her head up high if she went to go bail her son out of jail again. And so she turned her pickup up around and went back to the ranch and didn't bail her son out. And I was sitting there praying, please, God, let Roy hear that message. We got in the car to go home from the Lakeside, and as is our custom, we talked about the speakers, who our favorite one was and what they said and how dynamic they were. And I just knew Roy was going to say, man, that Al-Anon, she nailed me. I heard that part when she talked about bailing her son out of trouble one more time, and the awareness that that's enabling, and that she didn't need to do that anymore. And I just knew Roy was going to confess that and have a change of heart. And I asked him, okay, who was your favorite speaker? And he started talking about the Friday night speaker. And I'm like, oh, what? And I'm like, you didn't hear, oh man, he didn't get it. He didn't get it. And it was so right up his alley. I mean, it's the same situation. How could he not relate to that woman? When John got out of the penitentiary, he went to go spend a week with his mom in Kerrville, and then he was going to come spend a week with us. And the plan was, a friend of ours in California who's in AA said to Roy, you have helped hundreds and hundreds of guys. Let me do this for you. I can give him a job here in California, let him get on his feet good, and then, then if he wants to come back to Texas, he can. And Roy took him up on that. And he was also an ex-con, so he understood what John would be going through. So John was going to come stay with us for a week, and then Roy was going to send him to California. During that time, one of the things I said to Roy, and because of Al-Anon, I could set some boundaries. I said, I don't want John to drive my car, and I don't want him to be here by himself. And Roy said, oh, don't worry, he's not going to be driving anybody's car, and he's going to be going to the office with me every day, so that's not an issue. So John came, stayed with us, and one of the things, as soon as he walked in the door, I hugged his neck and I said, welcome home. And I hope you don't ever have to do what you just did for the last 5 years again. And he said, I don't want to do it either, TJ. And in the time that he spent at the office, John told one of the secretaries, I don't know what happened to TJ, but she was so kind to me. And Roy's secretary, who was in the program, said, it may be something to do with your drinking, John. The fact that you were sober at her house. But anyway, things kind of changed for John and I, and I'm grateful for that. Anyway, Friday, Roy put John on a plane to go to California. He called me. I was at school, and he said, are you almost done? And I said, yeah. And he said, meet me at FERS. I've just got through putting John on the plane. And I said, are you okay? And he said, I'll tell you when we get to FERS. So I met him at FERS, because I don't cook that much. And we sat down at the table, and I said, are you okay? And he said, last week when I went to go pick up John, he met Tom. They met halfway at Ballinger, and he said, I put in that tape of June Christensen from her tape from Lakeside, and she was telling her story about she was going to go bail her son out of jail one more time. And he said, I realized that I'd been enabling John. And I don't need to be doing that anymore. So I'm gonna go ahead and pay the child support for 2 more months, and then he's gonna start paying the child support, but I'm not gonna be the a Bank of America for John Bell anymore. And I just started crying because my prayers were answered. They weren't answered 2 years ago at that conference that we were at, but they were answered. And I thought, how does that happen? But only in Alcoholics Anonymous, that we get out of the way and let God happen, and these miracles happen. And John stayed sober, to my knowledge, without the help of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know what he's doing since Roy died, but he was doing really well and managing to not be dependent on Roy financially, and I'm eternally grateful for that, and I'm grateful for the Al-Anon speaker that did carry the message to Roy, and God knows it wasn't the resident expert at our house that did. I forgot to even look at the clock, and I don't know how much time I've got. Whatever? No, don't say that. How many more minutes do I have?
It's 2:26, TJ.
What time am I supposed to be done?
About 2:30.
Oh, wow.
Continue. No, we're not in a hurry.
Well, I need to tell about, there's 2 or 3 things that I need to tell about, but I just, I'm going to talk about Trinity, my granddaughter. Roy was a Trinity's rock. Trinity has had a lot of issues, and we couldn't even really figure out what was going on, but she was just off the wall. She reacted poorly to everything. She got mad easily. She was very defiant. If you told her, sit down, she would stand up just to prove to you she didn't have to sit down. She would see things and hear things that weren't there. She was scared of a man that was in her room. We couldn't see a man in her room, but she could, and she gave great description of what he looked like. And this was out of my area of expertise. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to fix this, and that was one of the things that I struggled with. It was, I don't know how to take care of my granddaughter. I don't know how to fix her. I don't know what to suggest to make it better. I don't know what to do. And Trinity went to psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist. She went to treatment. She's been to treatment 2 or 3 times. And I would always say to Roy, what are we going to do? And our mantra was, we're going to love her through it. And that's what we would say about John. What are we going to do about John? And one of us would always have enough of a foothold in recovery that would say, we're going to love him through it. So that was kind of our mantra to one another. We're going to love him through it. And I would say, what are we going to do with Trinity? And he said, we're going to love her through it. And Roy was always one of the ones that could calm her. If Roy wasn't around, it would be me. But my daughter would have such a terrible time with Trinity. She was just always an ultra challenge. And, every time you think, okay, she's really going to do better, and then she wouldn't. And just conflict at conflict at conflict at school. And she's a really bright little girl, but she just didn't want to do the work. She's like, I can do the work. I know I can do the work. Why do I have to do the work? And so she wouldn't. And it's just been really frustrating. And she's been to treatment, like I said, 4 times. She's had 2 suicide attempts. In the fall, it was just totally out of control. She was manic, and she would have one brilliant idea after another, and her impulsivity was she would act on all of these brilliant ideas that weren't brilliant ideas, but to her they were brilliant ideas. And she was failing all of the courses that she was taking in her senior year in high school. And it's like, Trinity, the light is at the end of the tunnel. You just have to do a few more months and you're done. And then you can take a break. If you don't want to go to college, you can take a break. At this point, just get your high school diploma. And she was enrolled in a program to where that when she graduated, she would have graduated with her high school degree and her associate's degree. But she failed art. She failed PE. And I'm an educator, and this was just killing me because I'm like, for Christ's sake, Trinity, it's art. All you have to do is, anything, and you would have gotten credit for it. And she plagiarized in art. Anyway, in December, she was failing 6 classes, and she alienated all of her professors. They were at the point they didn't even care if they didn't want her there anymore. They'd quit arguing with her, and because they quit arguing with her, she thought everything was fine. And she told me that everything's fine, nobody's saying anything to me. And I said, they're not saying anything to you anymore, Trinity, because they're just counting the days till you're gone. They're tired of messing with you. They're done. And so she kind of blew that opportunity. The only thing that we had going for us is that her principal, Mr. Ramage, was hell-bent and hell-bound that she was going to graduate. And so he put her in this GE-type program so that she could finish out her high school class just so that she could graduate. She had 6 classes that she had to take at this new school that she went to that she started in January. It was mandatory that she attend 4 hours a day. She could have gone all day long, but did she? No, she did her 4 hours and went home and spent the rest of the day in bed. It was kind of iffy whether she was even going to get it finished or not. It was 2 weeks ago. No, 3 weeks ago. I said, how close are you to graduating? And she said, I don't want to talk to you about it. You'll be mad at me about it. And I said, no, Trinity, I'm just concerned, and I just want to know where you are. I just want to know if you're going to graduate or not. And she said, it's none of your concern. However I do it, it's my problem. It's not yours. And besides that, I'm working on pre-cal. I'm on my very last class. All I have to do is pass pre-cal. And I'm like, oh, God, she's got a pre-cal. Oh. She made a 98 in pre-cal. And she graduated last night. And I'm powerless over that kid. I'm powerless over her mental illness. I'm powerless over the choices that she makes in the future. I'm just powerless over her in general. And last night at 5 o'clock, my daughter called me and she said, "I'm full of anxiety, Mom." And I said, "Why? It's graduation day. We're there." And she said, "Well, at the practice, there were 2 girls that Trinity had conflict." And she said, "I'm afraid there's going to be drama or fighting or whatever." And she said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "Well, if I have to, I'll take my earrings off and be a fighting grandma if I have to." But I can hear Nelda tell me we're going to walk through this with dignity and grace. So we're going to walk through this with dignity and grace, Danielle. And she said, "Okay, well, just so you know, I'm on your way by your house, and I want to borrow your pink jacket. So can I borrow your pink jacket?" And I said, "Sure." So she came by the house and got my pink jacket, and she looked exceptional in it. And we celebrated. There was no drama, and we were able to walk through that event with dignity and grace. I know I need to wrap this up, and there was 2 or 3 other things that I would have loved to have shared with you to get you up to date. But let me say this. I'll wrap it up by saying this. When I lost Roy, I didn't know how that I was going to keep on going without him. And the day that he died, Nelda called me that night and said, "I just heard about Roy." And I said, "Nelda, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this?" And she said, "We are going to do this one day at a time. And I'm available anytime you need me, morning, noon, or night, you call." Because she had been a widow too. I knew she had walked that pathway and could share her experience, strength, and hope, and I would get through it. I need to backtrack one more. I want to tell this one more little part. I'm sorry, y'all, but there's just so much on my heart right now that this lets me know that God is in control of everything. At our last lakeside that Roy and I went together, as we were crossing the gate onto the property, Roy said, "I think this is going to be my last lakeside." And I said, "I don't want to hear that, Roy." And the next day when Roy was at the board meeting, I took the Al-Anon speaker, one of her friends and another one of her friends, to lunch in Brownwood. Little did I know that all 3 of those women were widows. And they asked me how Roy's health was, and Roy had renal failure, and we were doing this dialysis at home, and I was adjusting to being a caregiver, and the machine was, it would go off during that alarms. It was like being in the hospital. And so I was saying it was an adjustment with this machine, but we were doing okay. And but I told them what Roy had said as we had crossed onto the property. And they said, "Well, in the likelihood that you lose him, there's going to be some things that you're going to experience." And they started sharing their experience during the hope as widows. And one of the things they said is that, you probably won't sleep well after he's gone. And I thought, that is the stupidest thing I ever heard. I'm not going to have any trouble sleeping. And that first night that Roy was gone, the CPAP machine wasn't on, the oxygen machine wasn't on, and the paralysis dialysis machine wasn't on. And my house was so stinking quiet, I couldn't sleep. And I was laying there with my eyes shut. My eyes literally hurt from crying all day long. And I couldn't sleep. And I remembered those 3 widows sharing their experience, strength, and hope with me just a few months earlier. And I'm like, okay, that's normal for me to not be able to sleep, so I'm going to be okay. they shared that, and so I'm going to be okay. You know, nobody died from not sleeping, and Roy's been gone 5.5 years, and I'm still having a hard time sleeping, but I'm not going to die from it. These women shared their experience, strength, and hope, and that's what I've learned in here in Al-Anon, is that everything that I've needed, I've got it from going to a meeting, and so I still need to go to meetings. Even though Roy's been gone for 5.5 years, I still need meetings. I love y'all, and I'm going to stop right there.